Are there any preliminary matters that we need to take up prior to the plaintiff calling the next witness?
None for plaintiffs, Your Honor.
None for the legislative defendants, Your Honor.
And none from the state defendants.
Okay, great. Who will be the plaintiff's next witness?
Your Honor, the plaintiffs will call Catherine Fellman.
All right, we could go ahead and let Ms. Fellman in. Who will be examining this witness on behalf of the parties?
For plaintiffs, I will, Your Honor.
And for legislative defendants, Your Honor, it will be John Tinkin.
The state defendants, Paul Cox.
All right, Mr. Tinkin, can you hear me?
Yes, Your Honor. Can you hear me?
All right, great. I can hear you as well. Thank you. All right. Ms. Riggs, you may call the next witness then.
Your Honor, plaintiffs call Catherine Fellman.
All right, Ms. Fellman, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I can hear you as well. Would you please raise your right hand? Ms. Beal, if you could swear in the witness.
Do you solemnly affirm that your testimony to the court will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and this is your solemn affirmation?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. You can lower your hand.
Ms. Riggs, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Can you please state your full name for the record?
It's Catherine Fellman.
What county and state do you live in, Ms. Fellman?
I live in Durham, North Carolina.
And what do you do for a living?
I am the executive director of You Can Vote.
What is You Can Vote?
You Can Vote is an educational nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and our mission is to educate, register, and empower all eligible North Carolinians to cast their ballot.
Okay. Before getting back into You Can Vote, can we talk about your experience working with voters more broadly? When did you first start working with voters?
It was in college. I was a volunteer intern for a senatorial campaign.
And did you continue working with voters after that?
Yes, I have worked with voters in almost every single election, especially in North Carolina since 2008.
When did you first move to North Carolina?
2005.
And in working with voters in North Carolina since 2008, what organizations were you associated with while doing that voter work?
I was a volunteer beginning in maybe January or February of 2008 with a local group called Durham for Obama. And then in 2010 to 2013, mid 2013, I worked for an organization called the Durham People's Alliance.
And how long have you worked at You Can Vote?
And I founded You Can Vote as a volunteer in late 2013, and we launched as a formal program in February of 2014.
Why was You Can Vote founded?
You Can Vote was founded shortly after the Supreme Court decision overturning part of the Voting Rights Act. And very shortly after that, the North Carolina General Assembly passed House Bill 589. And I wanted to create a program that supported North Carolinians in their right to vote and to educate them and prepare them for casting their ballot successfully with these new changing rules.
What are your primary responsibilities as executive director of You Can Vote?
I am in charge of all of the staff and programming and fundraising, all of our messages and communications to voters, our materials, everything goes through me.
Can you provide some examples of the types of work that You Can Vote does?
We are primarily focused on educating people on their right to vote. So we go out to events and festivals and in community partners, buildings such as health clinics and schools and you name it, detention centers, and we educate the residents or the community members about their right to vote. We answer their questions. We offer the upcoming election days and requirements, and then we register voters who need to update or their registration or get registered for the first time.
How many voters has You Can Vote trained? Sorry, strike that. How many volunteers has You Can Vote trained?
Over the past 7 years, we have trained over 4,100 volunteers across the state.
Okay. And you mentioned registering voters. How many voters has You Can Vote registered?
We have registered nearly 50,000 voters at this point.
Does You Can Vote put on educational programs directed at voters?
Yes, that's the primary focus of our work.
And do you have any estimate of how many voters you've reached through these educational programs?
Yeah, we consider a voter reached as having had a one-on-one conversation and being educated by one of our volunteers or our staff members. And we are up over 700,000 conversations at this point.
And all of these You Can Vote activities that you just described, have you personally performed these activities?
Yes.
How does You Can Vote choose where to deploy its volunteers and hold different events?
Well, we're trying to reach voters and educate voters who may not have easy access to up-to-date voting information or are new voters or infrequent voters. So we determine where we go based on the ability to talk to the voters who we want to serve and bring the election information to them. So, transit stations, we find people who move often and frequently. Schools, young people move very frequently in those first few years after high school and throughout college. So those are the main focuses of where we're bringing the voting information to low-income communities and young people.
Okay. Can you give us any sense of geographically across the state where You Can Vote's work is focused?
We got our start in Durham in 2014 because that's where I was from. But quickly we have spread across the state due to volunteers and community members who wish to bring this information to their communities. So now we reach from all the way from Charlotte to the coast in New Hanover with chapters and volunteers and staff in all of the major metropolitan areas of the state.
How many staff members does You Can Vote currently have?
Currently, we have 9.
And how many volunteers does You Can Vote currently have?
In 2020, we trained over 2,800 volunteers.
Do you have any processes by which you collect information from your staff and volunteers about their interactions with voters?
Yes. Since the very first time we went out in 2014, we have had a process to collect data from every volunteer shift, and that's called the Canvas Notes. So every volunteer will have a Canvas Notes sheet on their clipboard that they complete and turn into their captain at the end of every shift that describes how the site was, how the voter interactions were, any themes that they came across, how the materials were working, any suggestions for improvement on time or approach, any feedback from the management of the site, and then they turn those sheets into their captains, who also have a captain's log and can compile all the volunteer logs that worked under them for the day and write an overall assessment of the site and the event.
Does You Can Vote ever conduct focus groups?
Yes, of our captains and our volunteers, yes.
Information gathered through those Canvas Notes, captain's logs, and focus groups. Do you personally review that information?
Yes, and I personally facilitate the focus groups.
Does this affect, does the material you read and conversations you have, does it affect how you develop training material?
Absolutely. It informs our approach. When, out having conversations with voters, I call it an art and a science. You have to learn how people, how to approach them and offer this information in a way that opens up the conversation so that they can feel safe and able to ask questions, and not like we're trying to sell them on anything. We're just trying to help them become voters. So we need to take in this information and figure it out and see how the shifting narrative in the community around voting rights and knowledge and upcoming elections are impacting our conversation, and any things that we might need to change in order to address voters' common misconceptions.
Do you, based on this feedback that you get from your volunteers and your staff, what kind of changes do you regularly make to your training materials to make the information more accessible?
We have an eligible 8 that I had to create based on all of the common themes we were hearing back from our Canvas notes and from our volunteers about difficulty in sharing voting rules. And so, for example, the eligible 8 has our 8 common things that you're likely to hear out talking to your neighbors about voting, and the best practice way that we've found opens up the dialogue and strips away some of those misconceptions in a culturally competent way, in non-judgmental way, because it's easy to be confused and we don't want voters to feel like they should know this. A lot of people don't. And then we use that and we train our volunteers. We have a whole section in our training about how to overcome misconceptions that voters have.
You've mentioned these one-on-one conversations a few times. What are these conversations and why are they important?
These conversations are designed to take a North Carolina citizen to the next level of civic engagement. So the approach is always, I have information about voting, and we try to get somebody to stop and talk to us about their right to vote. And we lead with the fridge card that has the most up-to-date fact-based information. And that's generally a really great conversation starter, because if people have heard anything, it's that voting rules are changing. And so that's the way we can open up a bit of a conversation. And then from there, we can begin the education process on, oh, I didn't know there was an election coming up this year, is what we hear a lot of times in years like 2021 or 2018. And we can inform them about the upcoming election, what's on the ballot. And then if they need to, and then we ask if they've moved since they last voted and they need to update their registration. And if we do, we get them registered. But most people that we encounter are registered. And so we're trying to bring them along and prepare them for the next election as well, to just create that habit and that knowledge and that source of trusted and verified information that we offer every year in our fridge card that they can keep on their fridge. And if they have any questions, it's got the You Can Vote website on it, and they'll have something to refer back to.
Have you personally been involved in any of these one-on-one conversations with voters?
Hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of conversations with voters, yes.
I want to talk to you now about your experience with voters under the previous voter ID law. If I refer to it as House Bill 589, will you know what I'm referring to?
Yes.
So you mentioned that you founded You Can Vote because of House Bill 589 in part. Can you explain more about what about that bill led you to form You Can Vote?
I was specifically concerned about the photo ID requirement, as well as some of the other changes to, shortening early voting. But in my experience, having, educated voters and helped them tell them about voting dates in the past, voters have told me that, oh, I don't have my ID on me. I'm not going to be able to vote. And this was before there was even a voter ID requirement. And so I just felt that we needed to do some public education based on what I was hearing about from volunteers that I had worked with about when are they going to implement this law? It's not required in 2014. How are we going to ensure that voters show up to the polls in 2014 if they don't have photo ID, knowing it's not going to be implemented until 2016? So it was really complicated. And I decided that we should start educating people on what was coming so that they would know when they needed to provide a photo ID, and if they didn't get one in time, what processes they could use to still cast their ballot if they're eligible to vote.
Okay, so were you personally involved in these efforts to educate voters about the photo ID requirements in House Bill 589?
Yes, this is when we got our start, so yes.
And did you encounter in your work voters who did not have acceptable photo ID?
Yes.
Okay. And so I think you mentioned then talking to them about what their options were. Can you share with the court, when you talked to voters without photo ID, what options did you educate them about?
Yes. If we could recall, back during this iteration of the law, absentee ballots and rules around photo ID were not enacted around the absentee ballots. And so we would give voters the option of, if you don't have a photo ID, you can request to vote by mail. You can request an absentee ballot. We had absentee ballot requests to offer to voters on our clipboards if they did not have the photo ID that were required. And so that was one option. The other option is educating voters on the reasonable impediment waiver and how they would have to go in and advocate for themselves at the polls by requesting to vote without ID and having an excuse to vote without ID. So we had a sample of the reasonable impediment waiver on our clipboard, and I asked the Board of Elections for a version of it in Spanish. It wasn't available in Spanish right away. And so we'd have to go through those. You know, if you don't get an ID, that's okay. Either vote by mail, I can give you this now, or this is what you're going to need to request. But we really encourage you to advocate for yourself by voting in one way and not let this deter you.
Okay, I want to ask you about each of those in turn, but first, when you encountered voters who did not have a photo ID, did you or You Can Vote try to help them obtain photo ID?
No, that was not within our mission.
Why?
It takes a lot of work to get one person all of the documents, and for all the various reasons they may not possess their photo ID, and we just wouldn't have as much time to help individuals who don't have a photo ID obtain that versus the education that needed to happen to the broader public.
Okay. So Ms. Feldman, you mentioned you were encouraging voters to use the reasonable impediment. I think you called it waiver. Why did you call it a waiver?
I called it the reasonable impediment waiver to try to make it easier for voters to understand. And I rarely use the word reasonable impediment when educating voters. We specifically said, you know, no ID, that's okay. Ask for the waiver. Just much more accessible language. Voter-friendly language. We try to make all of our materials at a 4th, 6th grade reading level so that no one is intimidated by the process of voting. And, you know, using words like reasonable impediment to verify and attest that you are eligible to vote, that is very overwhelming. And when you start saying those words, even to volunteers who are training to educate voters, I witnessed their faces change because of how complex this sounded, and we want to make it easy for our volunteers to communicate this in the first place, and then make sure that it seems welcoming and friendly to new voters and voters who may not really care about voting, but we want them to care about voting.
As you were educating voters about the reasonable impediment process, did you understand voters to be challenged by understanding this process?
The look on faces, to me, it seemed like voters were a little overwhelmed with this prospect of having to have a different process than everybody else going into the polling site. So I was very concerned that although we talked about reasonable impediment, that people would be deterred from going and advocating for themselves at the polls to cast their ballot. That is why we really made sure that they understood the absentee ballot form as well.
Why do you say that voters would have to advocate for themselves?
We were not given any clear guidance from the state that said that the poll workers were going to be trained to offer this waiver to every voter if they were unable to produce a photo ID. And it was being offered inconsistently at polling sites across the state, is what we learned after the 2016 primary, when this regional impediment waiver was in place. And you have to know what to ask for in order to make your voice heard when there is, not a consistent poll worker training or implementation of this service.
Did you ever do any follow-up to see if voters that you had educated about their options were able to vote successfully?
When the photo ID mandate was struck down in 2016, at that time we had identified 169 individuals in our outreach that did not have the correct form of ID. And so what we did was, not to add to the confusion, was when early voting started, we just did our regular, get out the vote calls, and we called them and said, hey, we might have told you that you might need to use one of these workarounds if you didn't have a photo ID, but now you can just go vote. That's no longer the case. And so that's the kind of education that we did to those voters who we had identified, saying, don't worry about photo ID, just go vote. You need to get registered, bring a proof of residency document.
But did you ask them if they had been able to vote successfully in the primary?
I did not.
Why not?
We did not do a lot of voter turnout for the primary. So a lot of these voters that were registered probably did not vote in the primary. Just because it's much harder to get voters to turn out for a primary election.
Ms. Feldman, do you have personal knowledge that the voter ID requirement in place then was deterring voters from participating, regardless of whether they had acceptable ID or not?
Yes, I do.
Can you explain?
One of the things that we have constantly are fighting to help voters understand in North Carolina, and it really started in 2014, is the misconception that you can't even get registered, let alone vote, without a North Carolina state-issued photo ID. And so I've heard from voters over and over and over again, and this is one of the things we had to add to our training, is how to, when somebody says, I can't vote, you have to ask why. And one of the main reasons that on that why is, I don't have my ID with me. I don't have a North Carolina driver's license. I just moved here, or I'm a student. Those are the excuses to not get registered. And so when it comes to even showing up at the polls, if you don't think that you can even get registered without a state-issued ID, it's deterring for people to actually show up and vote if they don't have state-issued photo ID.
Objection, Your Honor. We would move to strike that previous answer as hearsay. She has not laid a foundation of personal knowledge outside of what voters told her.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Yes.
Your Honor, we've laid a foundation that Ms. Feldman has years of experience modifying materials and training in light of feedback from voters, and so that this is an exception under 8033. It was her present sense impression based on that feedback.
Give me just 1 second. The objection is overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Fellman, did voter education from the State Board of Elections around House Bill 589 end the voter confusion and misconception that you observed?
No.
And how does your work change if voters have had a bad experience voting after you've encouraged them to vote?
Well, all research shows, both international research on democracies and voting and our internal research on voting history, is that voting is a habit. And if somebody votes 3 times in a row, they are likely to become voters for life. And so when you interrupt that habit of voting, especially if a voter is trying to cast their ballot in a presidential election, which is one of the most salient elections for voters, you might not get another chance 4 years later to develop and create that habit, let alone in in an odd year where they might not. It might not, even less salience of an election. So interrupting the voting habit can have long-term, consequences on voting participation. And so we find it's very important that voters have a good experience, that we prepare them for what they're going to see and hear and need at the polls, so that when they come out, they're happy, they had their voice heard, and that they will want to continue to be part of our civics and our democracy.
From the perspective of someone working in voter services, Ms. Fellman, do you have any concerns about Senate Bill 824, the law where that is at issue in this litigation?
Yes.
What are those concerns?
My concerns are that the voters in this state have been facing constant rule changes and new hurdles and districts for the past 7 years. And, this is yet another new rule for voters to overcome. And with all of the misconceptions and confusion around voting, I personally believe that this will deter more voters in the long run.
Why do you think Senate Bill 824 will deter voters?
This bill requires photo ID for voting. And as I've testified, voters are deterred by photo ID requirements because of the confusion and misconceptions around types of IDs, what's acceptable, whether the address on the ID has to be up to date, even to just get registered, let alone vote. And I know that free IDs are available from the Board of Elections offices, but that makes voting a multiple stop event for people who may not live close to a site that offers free IDs and might not have the transportation or the ability to take a full day off of work to go get the identification required to vote, which is another day that you have to make arrangements and transportation to go and exercise your civic duty.
So do I follow from that the free ID from the County Board of Elections doesn't limit your concerns about the bill?
No.
What kinds of voters does You Can Vote serve that might have issues getting to county boards of elections to get a quote unquote free ID?
We serve many low-income voters and voters who live in rural areas who don't live close to their large county's Board of Election office, which may not be on public transportation. There are a lot of voters that do not drive, and there are a lot of voters who are in residential facilities that would be unable to go and get the needed requirements in order to cast their ballot, even though they are eligible to vote.
If the quote unquote free ID were offered at every early voting site in the state, would that eliminate your concerns about the bill?
It wouldn't, because we don't know where early voting sites are in proximity to the voters who need that ID. And I would be concerned that there would be, two different lines at an early voting site, which could be very confusing to voters and the flow of traffic and the polling officials. You might have to stand in one line for a really long time to get your photo ID, then get in the next long line to cast your ballot. That makes voting a whole day activity, and most people don't have the ability to take off work for an entire day just to cast their ballot. And I don't know what the funding and the availability of these IDs, and like I said, in where are the early voting sites, and are those sites convenient to everyone? Because as we know, a lot of people prefer to vote on election day because those polling sites are closer to their residence.
Does the presence of the reasonable impediment process in Senate Bill 824 eliminate the concerns that you have about Senate Bill 824?
No.
Why not?
As I testified, the reasonable impediment form is complicated. It's complicated to tell voters that they need to advocate for themselves at the polling sites to become a voter. It can be it's intimidating for first-time voters who are unsure of the process of voting and need that extra reassurance that all you need to go in and talk to the poll worker and state your name. We do a lot of education for first-time voters to make them feel more comfortable, and it would be overwhelming in my observation to many people who are wavering on whether they want to participate to actually then go and do it if they know they might be challenged or if they have to sign an attestation and not be offered a ballot like everybody else who is registered.
Does the change in law in Senate Bill 824 compared to House Bill 589 with respect to providing photo ID with an absentee ballot affect your concern with this current law?
That really increases my concern for people who are physically unable to get to the polls, because often they do not have access to a copier or a printer to make a copy of their photo ID, and oftentimes they lack photo ID. For example, in detention centers, where we serve voters and help them with their absentee ballot requests, and making sure that they're registered on site if they don't have a registration site outside of the facility. And oftentimes those residents do not have their ID on them physically in the detention center.
Does the fact that those voters may be able to claim a reasonable impediment eliminate your concern in voting absentee with the ID requirement?
No, my concern is still that these voters, the forms are complex, and that's why it takes this one-on-one education that we do, and we go into facilities and help people understand the form and complete the form. And so another form is that much more work for us and that much more work for the voter. That's multiple steps for voters who are less engaged from society, and then we want to make them more engaged in our society. So that it's really concerning to me to have to submit a photo ID copy with your absentee ballot.
Ms. Fellman, have you had the opportunity to speak with Black voters and leaders in the Black community in various places around the state about the voter ID law at issue here?
Yes, I have.
And did those conversations change in any way your concerns about Senate Bill 824?
Those conversations made me even more concerned because I witnessed community leaders looking defeated when I was explaining the upcoming laws and changes and potential workarounds and unknowns and uncertainties. I even overheard multiple people. This is a common theme I hear when we're talking about changing legislation and new rules and new restrictions is they just don't want us to vote, is what impression I get. And it's a common thing I've been hearing over the past few years from our Black community leaders.
Ms. Fellman, would more time for education and more education funding completely eliminate your concerns as a voter support professional with Senate Bill 824?
Well, more timing is always great. It does not eliminate my concerns because the folks who are most vulnerable to not casting their ballot and being left out of the process, I feel like are even more vulnerable under this additional these additional restrictions when it comes to absentee balloting and ID.
Do messengers matter when educating voters about voting laws?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Why?
If in some neighborhoods, if somebody doesn't know you, they don't want to engage and don't want to talk to you. And so we find that we're most successful in educating voters when we empower community leaders and trusted messengers from the community to be having these conversations and to equip them with the latest and greatest facts so that they can disseminate it within their communities. We have worked very hard to build trust and we wear our orange shirts that clearly say what we do. And we always tell voters we are nonpartisan. We're not here to tell you what to do. We just want to help you understand your right. And that does open the doors for us and our volunteers and community leaders to have these conversations. But there's so much information around elections that doesn't come from trusted messengers, and that we oftentimes in presidential years like we just had is misinformation and disinformation, that we are very, very careful what we say to voters and who we are having lead those conversations.
Ms. Fellman, in your deposition in this case in 2019, do you recall saying something along the lines of you'd need at least 2 election cycles before a voter ID law could be implemented?
Yes, I recall saying that.
Do you have any more personal knowledge and information now about implementation of Senate Bill 824 than you did when you sat for that deposition in 2019?
So, I do. I was thinking in that deposition about the ramp up we had in 2014, and this was at that time coming down the pipeline very quickly with the upcoming presidential election. But after we got through the past year in 2020, and now I have been seeing more and more confusion and frustration and voters and community leaders feeling exacerbated by all these changes to their right to vote when it should be simple and straightforward and not that complicated. And so, in my opinion, you need even more time, and you need to ensure that these trusted messengers and community leaders and teachers and civic teachers and everybody can easily explain voting to somebody with or without ID.
Ms. Fellman, why was it important for you to testify today?
It's really important for me to testify today because I believe that every eligible North Carolinian should be able to easily understand and access their right to vote.
Thank you. No further questions, Your Honor. I pass the witness.
All right, cross-examination, Mr. Tinkin.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Ms. Fellman. My name is John Tinkin with Cooper and Kirk, representing legislative defendants in this matter. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I just want to get a point of clarification. You are not here today offering testimony as an expert witness. Plaintiffs have not identified you as an expert, and you've not produced a report or provided documentation underlying your opinions on your direct testimony, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Now, in 2018, you were personally opposed to the constitutional amendment requiring voter ID?
I personally was, yes.
And you hope that North Carolina voters would vote against that constitutional amendment, correct?
I hope that North Carolina voters were educated on the ramifications and the unknowns of that legislation in order to make an informed decision.
So would you say you hoped the North Carolina voters would vote against it?
I hope that it would fail.
Okay, thank you. And you are opposed to Senate Bill 824 as a policy matter, correct?
Correct.
And now I think on direct, you discussed a little bit about your previous experience. You previously worked for the Durham's People's Alliance, correct?
Correct.
And that was until mid 2013 or so, is that right? And the Durham's People's Alliance had taken a position against voter ID at the time, is that correct?
Correct.
And as part of your responsibilities with the Durham's People's Alliance, would you from time to time post to the People's Alliance website about events that the Durham's People's Alliance was hosting?
That was part of my job.
And would that include events opposed or organizing, events that were organized to be opposed to voter ID that was then under consideration?
I believe so. I was in charge of the social media communications. Yes.
Thank you. Now, in your current position as executive director of You Can Vote, you submitted public comments to the North Carolina State Board of Elections during rulemaking for Senate Bill 824, correct?
Correct.
Ms. Hardiman, if we could pull up exhibit labeled LX 245, and this is the You Can Vote comment during the rulemaking to the NCSBE. Ms. Feldman, do you recognize this comment?
Yes.
Scroll down to your signature page, that would help too.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And if we could go to paragraph 8 of this comment, and you see, do you see that all right? Is that zoomed in enough for you, Ms. Feldman?
Yes. Yes.
And you see that paragraph 8 starts with consider eliminating the ID requirement.
Yes.
And in this paragraph, your organization makes a number of arguments for why the state board should consider eliminating that ID requirement, correct?
Yes.
And so your organization has taken the position that the state should consider eliminating that ID requirement, right?
In the statement, myself as an executive director said, this is what I put together. Yes.
Do you agree with that statement that you put together?
Well, I know that the state board cannot. They have to implement the elections based on the rules of the North Carolina General Assembly.
Do you agree with that statement, though?
The State Board of Elections can't do that. But I understand where I was coming from is trying to make the argument that the voter ID requirement is a problem for voters.
Okay, thank you. And now I think on direct, you talked a little bit about your concerns with how SB 824 would be implemented. You don't have any personal knowledge of or information about what the implementation plans for Senate Bill 824 would be if the injunction was lifted, correct?
Correct. I have some of the language from before it was enacted about mailing to voters and things like that. Yeah.
But you don't know what the North Carolina State Board of Elections or other entities would do for implementing it if the
No.
injunction were lifted.
No.
And so it follows then that you also don't know what community organizations or different types of outreach programs would be included in that implementation plan, correct?
Correct.
And similarly, you don't have any information or personal knowledge as to what the reasonable impediment form would look like under Senate Bill 824 if the injunction were lifted, correct?
I think I'm trying to remember if we got a draft of that before it was lifted, but I'm imagining it will be similar to the previous one, but I do not know what the current one is. Excuse me.
Ms. Spellman, if you need a few moments, you can turn your camera off and mute yourself and take a few moments to collect yourself if you need to.
Pollen.
Yeah, please take a moment. It's no problem.
All right. I don't know why my screen is froze like that.
Are you ready to go forward?
I am.
Okay, if you need some more time, that's perfectly okay. Yeah, we've all been there.
Oh, allergy season.
All right, if you're ready, then Mr. Timken, you can ask your next question.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Homan, I think on direct, you mentioned that your organization has interacted with around 700,000 voters. Is that right?
Correct.
And you have not personally talked to all the voters that You Can Vote has encountered, right?
Correct.
Do you know what percentage of voters that you've personally contacted?
I'm not sure of the exact percentage. No.
Do many of the voters that interact with You Can Vote only interact with volunteers?
Many voters interact with volunteers or our staff members. Yes.
Okay. And I think you mentioned this on direct, but after talking with voters, the You Can Vote volunteers will make Canvas note sheets about their interactions during their shift.
Yes.
And then after their shift is done, You Can Vote volunteers will debrief with captains or field leaders, right?
Yes.
And then you and your staff will hear from the captains and field leaders about what the volunteers heard from the voters, right?
Correct.
So with those voters that only spoke to volunteers, your understanding about those voters comes to you third hand. Is that right?
So our captains and field leaders and staff are right there alongside of our volunteers. Volunteers do not work alone. And so a supervisor is always on site. But not always, generally is right nearby our volunteers. So doing the same work as the volunteers. So it's not like their volunteers are out in the bubble doing it on their own and coming to report back. We're working right alongside of them to coach them and mentor them in this work.
But I believe you mentioned on direct that the conversations with individual voters are one-on-one. Is that right?
It's between the volunteer or captain and the voter. But oftentimes it's at a table or a festival and we watch our volunteers interact with voters because it's so our volunteers will have questions until they've worked multiple shifts with us.
Okay. But so a volunteer speaks with a voter and then relays what that voter said to captains and field leaders. And those captains and field leaders will sometimes relay that information to you if you're not at that event or not at that table, right?
Correct.
You Can Vote does not record every encounter that its volunteers and employees have with voters, right?
Correct.
Does You Can Vote keep a database that identifies each and every voter that it has talked to?
No.
And so You Can Vote doesn't have a database that identifies the demographics or other information about each voter that your organization contacts, correct?
Not for our field conversations, no.
If your organization interacts or speaks with a voter that does not have any concerns, are those responses recorded?
No.
And I think on direct, you mentioned that You Can Vote is present in many different parts of the state. Is that correct?
Yes.
Were there any efforts made to ensure that your volunteers are speaking to a representative sample of voters at each of those locations?
The locations were popular locations with the community, serving the voters who, serving the community of voters we're trying to serve. So I feel like they were a good representative sample of voters in that community.
Oh, you don't know. if they were a representative sample. Is that correct?
Objection, asked and answered.
Just 1 second. Oh, the objection's over.
Would it be helpful to repeat my question?
Yes, you can repeat your question.
Yeah. Ms. Feldman, you don't know if the voters you contacted in those locations were a representative sample. Is that correct?
Correct.
What efforts, if any, were made to ensure that your volunteers were speaking with a representative? Oh, I'm sorry. What efforts, if any, were made to ensure that your volunteers were not suggesting answers to the voters with whom they spoke?
Could you clarify that?
Sure. I guess what I'm getting at is sometimes questions are asked in a way that may suggest an answer. I'm just wondering if in your training that you spoke about on direct, what assurances do you do to make sure that the questions that your volunteers are asking voters are not suggesting the correct answer or the expected answer from that voter?
Our training is on how to approach and educate a voter on their right to vote and how to enter into an authentic conversation with a voter and actually listen to what they are saying and hearing and then interpreting what you're hearing them say and respectfully bringing them to the next level of civic engagement and bringing them the correct factual information. And the only approved things that we are sharing with voters, the only thing we allowed our volunteers to share with voters are the materials and the information that they have learned in their training about the right to vote, the upcoming election days, and how to get registered to vote.
Okay, and we've spoken a little bit about the Canvas notes, but on the Canvas notes, do volunteers record the exact responses and words that the voters used?
The Canvas notes will ask questions. So if a voter has a concern that the volunteer is unable to answer, they ask their captain or staff person who's with them on that site to help the voter understand, because this is really complicated stuff and not all volunteers know how to support or did not remember their training to how to support each and every voter's question or navigating each and every voter's like residency issues with registration, etc. But the word for word volunteer questions do not get recorded on that sheet. But if a captain has a question that they cannot answer, then they call it up to staff. So we have a chain of command. If someone can't answer that question for a voter, we try to get it answered while the voter is with us. And then only sometimes will we have a follow-up question that was for some reason be unable to be answered on site, which I'd say 99% of information is answered on site for the voter. The only time a direct question from a voter that was unable to be answered is, would be on the Canvas notes is in that instance when they weren't able to, and the voter needed to be followed up with to answer their question.
Okay. You Can Vote did not keep track of the number of voters that were confused about photo ID, correct?
Correct.
And so you don't know the percentage of voters that you interacted with, whether they were confused, correct?
I would, in my experience in the field, I rarely had anyone tell me, oh, no, I have the latest and greatest voting information. It was literally people will stop in their tracks when I tell them that I have the latest rules for voting and say, oh, I need that because voters are having such a hard time keeping up with the latest rules for voting.
And I guess you've spoken to the voters that were confused, but you do not keep track of the voters that you interacted with that were not confused about photo ID requirements, right?
And there's no reason for us to keep track of that, no.
And has your organization tracked questions about other voter requirements like registration requirements, precincts, early voting, or curbside voting questions?
We we keep track of the overarching questions and what we need to do to improve our materials to ensure that we can easily answer the pervasive questions. And that oftentimes includes early voting locations, dates, and so those are prominent on our materials.
And so you would agree that even in elections without voter ID requirements, the voters that you've interacted with have all of these questions about the timing of elections, the dates, what's on the ballot, how to look up their registration, and things like that, right?
Correct.
This is particularly true if there's been a recent change in the election rules, right?
Correct.
And you don't have any comparisons on the number of voters that were confused about one type of election issue versus another type of an election issue, right?
I don't have any hard numbers because oftentimes we are tackling several combined questions for the voting public that, you know, isn't part of maybe the 10% or 5% of us that pay attention to all of the rules of voting every year. So we're oftentimes bringing them multiple pieces of information to give them a comprehensive but easy guide to be able to cast their ballot in the upcoming cycle.
Would it be fair to say your organization only goes to places and talks to people that need extra information?
We don't only go to places where people need extra information, but we try to pick places and sites and partnerships where we can talk to a broad range and a large number of voters to maximize our impact.
But it would be fair to say that You Can Vote has not engaged with the majority of North Carolina voters, right?
Well, we've had 700,000 conversations, so that's not the majority.
And so with respect to the North Carolina voters that you and your organization have not talked to, you don't know what any of those voters think about voter ID, correct?
Correct.
And you haven't published any peer review papers on voter confusion, correct?
Correct.
Okay. On Direct, I believe you mentioned that your organization identified 169 eligible voters that said to your organization they did not have acceptable photo ID under the old HB 589 law. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that was out of 100,000 voters that your organization had contacted between 2014 and 2016, right?
Right.
So that's roughly 0.17%, right? I'll represent to you that 169 divided by 100,000 is roughly 0.17%.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. And to clarify, you did not personally identify all of these 169 voters, right?
I identified several, but not all of them.
And what, if anything, did your organization do to confirm that these 169 individuals were registered and eligible to vote in North Carolina?
During our conversation with these voters, we shared with them the new and upcoming photo ID rules, the upcoming election dates, and we asked them if they were in fact registered to vote. The vast majority of these voters were not yet registered, and so we registered them to vote or helped them complete their voter registration application.
Did you do anything to verify that these 169 individuals did not have eligible ID?
Just like in the voter registration form, when you're attesting that you are a citizen and you are eligible, we trust the voters when they say that they do not have one of the approved photo IDs.
And you have not provided information on whether those 169 voters were able to obtain photo IDs that are acceptable under SB 824, correct?
No, correct.
And you have not provided information on whether there is any reason those specific 169 voters could not obtain acceptable ID under SB 824, correct?
Correct.
And you're aware that unlike HB 589, SB 824 provides for the use of authorized school IDs, correct?
Correct.
And you have not provided any information on the number of those voters, on the number of voters in that 169 that were students, correct?
Correct.
Do you know that number?
I do not know that number. No.
And you're aware that unlike HB 589, SB 824 provides for the use of certain state and local government employee IDs, correct?
Correct.
And you have not provided any information on the number of voters in that 169 that were state or local government employees, correct?
Correct.
And do you know that number?
No, we do not ask the voters what if they're state employees or their occupation or any of that information. No.
And you are aware that unlike HB 589, SB 824 requires that county boards of election provide free IDs to registered voters, correct?
Correct.
And now that free IDs are available at county boards without requiring documentation, will your organization educate voters that lack ID about that option?
We will definitely educate voters on that. But we will also make sure that they know their options if they are unable to get to that site, so that no one will stay home if they didn't have a chance to make it to their county board of elections when the election time comes up.
And so one of those options you're aware of is that voters can vote without qualifying voter ID under SB 824, right?
My understanding is that it's with that reasonable impediment attestation.
And if SB 824 is allowed to go into effect, will your organization advise voters that they can vote without qualifying voter ID?
We will be advising them that they about their options to either obtain one or to advocate for themselves by completing, requesting and completing correctly the reasonable impediment waiver.
Your Honors, if I could just check my notes real quick. Thank you, Ms. Feldman. Nothing further, Your Honors.
All right, Mr. Cox.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have no questions.
Okay, redirect Ms. Riggs. You're muted, Miss Riggs, I think.
I made it through almost 2 weeks of trial, I think, without that happening. I'm sorry, Your Honor. Just one quick question. Ms. Fellman, given all of the education efforts that your organization has done over the years, regardless of the rule changes, is it your experience that your education efforts ultimately eliminate the barriers that voters face in casting a ballot?
They do not eliminate, it's not nearly enough to eliminate all of the confusion that is out there across the state and in every event that we hold. We're small but mighty. However, there is persistent confusion around voting requirements, especially voter ID.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Any requests, Mr. Tinkin or Mr. Cox?
No, Your Honor.
Your Honor.
All right. Ms. Fellman, thank you very much for being here. You are now free to leave the virtual courtroom. Appreciate your attendance.
Thank you for having me. Have a good day.
Ms. Riggs, are you prepared to call the plaintiff's next witness?
Yes, Your Honor. My colleague Taylor Williams will call via video Karen Brinson Bell to play some of her testimony from her 30B6 deposition.
Okay. Tell me her name again.
State Board of Elections Director Karen Brinson Bell. We took her 30B6 deposition and we'll be playing clips from that.
Okay. And I suppose that's played via video.
Yes, Your Honor.
Are you going to introduce that video into evidence?
Well, we're going to play the video. I believe we were hoping it would be transcribed. If it's not, we can also introduce the transcripts with the particular lines and designations specifically.
Generally speaking, in a trial civil case, when videotape depositions or transcripts taken prior to trial are offered into evidence or played to the jury, they're certainly introduced as exhibits. They're marked and foundation and so forth. But generally speaking, when a videotape deposition or a transcript, for example, is read to the jury, the court reporter does not take that down because that has already been transcribed by an official court reporter. I have instructed the court reporter in this case that when lawyers cross-examine a witness with a specific portion of their particular deposition, that she is to, as best she can, take that down. And that's the reason I've had the lawyers specify, if not a timestamp, at least a line and page number, in addition to potentially publishing that transcript and sharing their screen and posting that transcript so the court reporter can see what's being cross-examined with. And so I've asked her to take down in that scenario, but I've specifically allowed her not to take down any 30B6 depositions that are introduced into evidence in the manner that you seek to do so now. So, because she's transcribing something that's already been transcribed.
So,
and there's no reason to have the transcription of a transcription. So, in order for you to publish that exhibit, I think that it probably is a stipulation that it can be received, but I do believe it needs to be introduced into evidence in the case and then published to the court.
yes, Your Honor. And I should note that the designations and counter designations from Ms. Bell's 30B6 deposition are included. The designations and the counter designations. We've worked out the objections to the extent the designations and counter designations are not exhibits, we're happy to introduce them as the next joint exhibit number, and play the video for you to hear her answers and relieve Ms. Fawcett of the challenge of transcribing as you watch.
Okay. I assume that Taylor Williams is the lawyer that asked Ms. Bell questions during the videotape depositions, correct?
No, Your Honor, it was a colleague of ours who's no longer with the Paul Weiss law firm, Jessica Morton. But again,
Okay.
I'd just like to reiterate, Ms. Bell is busy, and so we've come to agreement with defendants and legislative defendants about designations and counter designations from this 30B6 deposition, so that you could hear her testimony without her having to appear live.
Okay. Mr. Thompson, you wish to be heard?
No, Your Honor, we have no objection to proceeding in the manner that the court has set forth.
Mr. Cox, do you wish to be heard?
No, we are perfectly fine with this approach.
Thank you. All right. I guess then, Ms. Williams, you may proceed.
Good morning. I'm Jessica Morton with the Paul Weiss Law Firm, and I represent plaintiffs in this matter. With me today is my colleague, Taylor Williams, who will be helping out. Do you prefer Ms. Bell or Ms. Brinson Bell?
Ms. Bell's fine. I'll make it short for you.
So you're the Executive Director of the North Carolina State Board of Elections, right?
Yes, I am.
What do your responsibilities entail in that role?
So I'm the Chief Elections Official for the state of North Carolina. I oversee the State Board of Elections as an agency, which is approximately 75, 85 employees, given the temporary staff that we have currently. I also have oversight of the county boards of elections, which there are 100 county boards of elections. So we're responsible for the administration of elections as well as compliance with campaign finance reporting. And so I oversee that as well.
Do you understand that you're here today in two separate capacities, both your capacity as an individual and also as Executive Director, as a representative of the State Board?
Yes.
And you understand that as a representative of the State Board under Rule 30b-6, you're testifying to the knowledge of the State Board as an entity, not just your own personal experience, right?
Yes, I understand that.
Taylor, could you please pull up the amended 30b-6 deposition notice? Have you seen this document before?
I have.
And you understand that this is the notice to testify in your representative capacity?
Yes.
If you could, either you or Taylor, turn to page 2.
I'm there.
Great. It lists out 10 topics for deposition, right?
It does, yes.
Are you prepared to testify on behalf of the State Board as to each of those 10 topics?
I am.
So going forward, I'm going to try to be clear about whether I'm asking you questions in your personal capacity or representative capacity. But if you're ever confused about that, please just let me know. And for the time being, unless I say otherwise, just understand that I'm asking questions in your representative capacity. So that means that you should answer based on all that you've done to educate yourself in preparation of deposition, not just your personal knowledge that you witnessed. Does that make sense?
It does.
Oh, I'm sorry. Taylor just informed me that I failed to actually mark this exhibit, which I intended to do. So we're marking this amended notice as Exhibit 6. Thanks, Ms. Bell. So let's start by turning to SB 824. What is your understanding of what SB 824 is?
This was the legislation that came about following the constitutional amendment question pertaining to photo ID for North Carolina.
And so SB 824 enacted a photo ID law for voting. Is that right?
That's correct.
And SB 824 was enacted on December 19th, 2018. Is that right?
That's right.
The next series of questions, I want you to focus your answers on the time period before December 19th, 2018, okay?
Okay.
To be clear, when I say the state board, I mean, anyone working for the state board. And when I say the legislature, I mean any member of the General Assembly or their staffers. Does that make sense?
It does.
So we'll mark this as Exhibit 7. And for the record, this is case number Holmes SBOE POD 022536. Ms. Bell, this is an email chain between Mark Coggins and staffers from the state board. Is that right?
It is.
And it's dated, the top date email is dated October 2018.
Yes, it is.
And so that's from before when the constitutional amendment related to voter ID passed. Is that right?
That would be right. Yes.
Mr. Coggins is a staffer for Representative David Lewis. Is that right?
That's my understanding.
And at this time, Mr. Representative Lewis was the chairman of the House Select Committee on Elections. Is that right?
That's my understanding. Yes.
And do you have an understanding of whether Mr. Lewis, or Representative Lewis, was ultimately in favor of SB 824?
As I recall, yes.
So in this email chain, looking at the bottom of page 1, Mr. Coggins was seeking information from the state board in preparation for a debate on voter ID, correct?
That's right.
So then if we go to the second page of this document and scroll down, you'll see that there are some earlier emails from back in July 2016. You see that?
Yeah, I do.
So I'm looking at the email timestamped 4:18 p.m. And Mr. Neesby of the state board says that as of today, which is July 20th, 2016, 4,131 free ID cards had been issued. Is that right?
Yes, that's what he states.
So in a little over 2 years and 2 months, there were about 3,400 free IDs issued in North Carolina.
That would be, yes.
So about 1,500 a year, if we assume they're issued at a regular rate.
Yes, divide out to that, yes.
Okay. North Carolina had about 7 million registered voters in the 2020 general election. Is that right?
Yes, a little over 7 million.
At the time SB 824 passed, there were about 250,000 registered voters in North Carolina who who lacked qualifying ID to vote. Is that right?
There was an analysis that said that there might be that number of individuals.
Do you have any reason to believe that analysis was wrong?
I think that there were I don't know that it's wrong, but I think that there are aspects of the criteria that may mean that it's not completely inclusive, or it may be overly inclusive.
What aspects do you mean?
I mean, there was a series of criteria. It pulled from the DMV database. There are other IDs that an individual could use. So there's contributing factors to where you can't say that list or the analysis is 100% certain. So that's why I said that it's not necessarily wrong, but it may not be completely right.
I see. But you don't have any examples of specific criteria that give you doubt about the analysis?
So would you ask your question again, please?
Sure. Do you have any examples of specific criteria that give you doubt about that analysis?
I'm suggesting that the analysis pulled from different matching criteria and a single source with the DMV, for example, to where that may not be comprehensive, or it may be overly comprehensive.
Assumed a moment ago, based on a regular rate of ID, free ID is being distributed, that approximately 1,500 free IDs were distributed to North Carolina voters a year between 2016 and 2018. And we discussed an analysis stating that approximately 250,000 registered voters in North Carolina lacked ID as of December 2018. And so taking those numbers, isn't it the case that with those assumptions in place, less than 1% of the 250,000 registered voters who lacked qualifying ID were obtaining free IDs each year?
I believe that what you're stating is correct. I mean, in terms of the number of people who were obtaining free IDs each year, assuming that they would be from that same group of people, that would be I believe, mathematically correct on the number of people obtaining free IDs specifically.
Has the state board conducted any analysis of the burden, if any, on a voter to obtain a free ID in terms of things like transportation or time away from work or any other opportunity cost?
I'm not aware of an analysis done by the state board, at least on that.
Has the state board conducted any analysis of whether or not people who live in poverty may experience more difficulties in obtaining a free ID than people who don't live in poverty?
I'm not aware of an analysis done by the state board on that either. We conduct elections.
Has the state board conducted any analysis of whether any racial group would or would not experience more difficulties than others in obtaining a free ID?
I'm not aware of the State Board of Elections doing that analysis either.
For the record, this is Holmes SBOE POD 024476. And this is a cover email with an attachment to it. So Ms. Bell, this is email correspondence between the state board and staffers Representative David Lewis, correct?
Yes, it is.
It's from November 2018, right?
That's correct.
If you look at the first email at the top, it says, please find Executive Director Strack's presentation. Am I saying her name correctly?
Yes.
Thank you. Who is Kim Strack?
She's my predecessor as State Executive Director.
And Representative Lewis, if you scroll down to the bottom of that first page, had formally requested that Director Strack be present on previous voter ID education efforts. Is that right?
That is what the email indicates.
And this is in relation to SB 824. Is that right?
It appears so, yes.
That's actually, I'm sorry, start at page 24494. And this is page 19 of the PDF. That's easier for those of you who are following along. So this page on the slide discusses a no match list, right?
It does, yes.
What is a no match list?
So in this particular case, the no match list is comparing those in the DMV, Department of Motor Vehicles database, to the voter registration roll database, looking for individuals who could not be matched with a DMV identification card.
So the no match list is meant to suss out voters who are registered voters who don't necessarily have a DMV ID. Is that right?
That's correct. In this case, that's the no match list.
And the slide states in the second bullet that in February 2015, there were 254,391 registered voters who could not be matched to a DMV identification card, right?
Yes, that's what it states.
This deck doesn't contain any no match analysis more recent than February 2015, does it? You should obviously take some time to go through if you'd like to.
I don't believe that it does, no.
Are you aware of whether the state legislature asked the state board for any analysis of the racial demographics of those 254,391 voters?
I'm not aware of whether that was specifically asked or not. There's indication in the analysis that has been done that indicates that there were legislative and media requests, but it does not specify exactly what was requested.
So you aren't aware of any specific request for the racial demographics of those 254,000 voters?
I don't know where if there was a specific request to that or not. I don't have record of that.
We can turn to page 24506. So this page discusses data from the 2016 primary, right?
Can I interrupt just 1 second, please? It's now 3:15. Mr. Williams, we started back at 1:45, and so probably going to go ahead and take a break right now. It's been about an hour and a half. We'll break until 3:30, then we'll come back and go until 5, okay?
All right.
So let's take about a 15-minute break at this point. We'll come back at 3:30. Thank you.